Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was a cathedral of power, its vast chamber carved from obsidian mined from dead worlds. The high ceiling, domed and endless, reflected the cold glow of the central skylight, illuminating the gathered representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. The air was thick with the weight of history. Treaties signed, empires forged, species erased. This was where the fate of entire worlds was decided with a whisper or a decree. And today, humanity stood trial. Ambassador Elias Kane felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him as he stepped forward. The murmurs had died to silence. The judgment already passed before a single word had been spoken. He had stood in this chamber before, argued, pleaded, reasoned. None of it had mattered. He straightened his stance, shoulders squared, expression impassive. He would not plead today. At the far end of the hall, High Chancellor Varesh regarded him with the stillness of a predator before the kill. Draped in the ceremonial robes of his station, his violet eyes unreadable, he exuded the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had already won. Beside him, the Kroth warlord shifted, scales glistening under the golden light, his lip curled in something between amusement and contempt. The rest of the council sat in a silent semicircle, their alien forms varying in size and shape, but their decision was singular. They had already decided humanity's fate. Varesh's voice was smooth when he spoke, almost gentle. Ambassador Kane, humanity stands at a crossroads. Kane's jaw tightened. No, he said. We passed that point long ago. A ripple of disapproval coursed through the chamber. The Kroth delegate let out a low growl, but Kane did not flinch. He had seen this play out before, the condescending patience, the illusion of diplomacy. Today, he would not entertain the lie. Varesh exhaled, as if speaking to a wayward child. Then let us be direct. The council has deliberated on humanity's ambitions. A murmur of amusement from the gathered delegates. You have expanded rapidly, Varesh continued. Too rapidly. Your reach extends into sectors that have remained balanced for millennia. Your technology evolves beyond what your species should be capable of. Your alliances are reckless, disrupting the stability we have maintained for generations. If left unchecked, your people will one day challenge the foundation of this council. Kane said nothing. He let the words settle, let the weight of them fill the silence. Varesh's voice dropped, smooth and deliberate. We cannot allow that. There it was. The mask removed, the truth spoken aloud. The council had never intended to allow humanity to rise. Kane met the High Chancellor's gaze, unflinching. So what will it be? Sanctions? Military occupation? Or will you simply call it what it is? Varesh's expression did not change. Humanity will submit to council rule. You will dissolve your independent government. Your fleets will be disbanded. Your colonies will be placed under supervision. Your people will be guided by those who understand the balance of power. Kane almost laughed. Guided. As if humanity had not carved its existence from the bones of hardship, had not fought and bled for every inch of progress it had made. As if humanity had not learned the hard way that survival was something one had to take, not something granted. The Kroth warlord leaned forward, baring jagged teeth. You should be honored. No other species has been given such mercy. Kane turned toward him, his expression unreadable. And if we refuse? Varesh's voice was final. Then humanity will be erased. Silence fell like a heavy shroud. Kane inhaled slowly. He had known this was coming. The council believed itself invincible, its rule unshakable. They had watched civilizations crumble under their authority, entire species bow before their laws. They thought humanity would do the same. They had miscalculated. Kane's hand moved to his jacket, fingers brushing against the cool metal of the device hidden within. He pressed it once. A simple signal. No alarm sounded. No weapons appeared. But across the galaxy, in the dark corners beyond the council's reach, warships stirred. A fleet hidden in exile. An army forged in silence. Humanity had never intended to beg for survival. He straightened, his voice calm. Then let me return the favor. Varesh's eyes narrowed slightly. What are you doing? Kane smiled, but there was no humor in it. The United Human Empire does not recognize the authority of this council. Effective immediately, we withdraw from all diplomatic obligations. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted, some rising from their seats, others murmuring among themselves. The Kroth warlord snarled something in his native tongue, his claws flexing, but Kane did not stop. He turned on his heel, striding toward the great chamber doors. They groaned open before him, revealing an armored escort. Human soldiers clad in dark combat gear, weapons holstered but ready. The council guards stiffened, hands moving toward their sidearms, but no one made a move. Not yet. Kane did not look back as he walked past the threshold. They had not come alone, and they had never intended to leave peacefully. The void beyond Proxima Centauri was a vast and merciless expanse, but tonight it was a battlefield waiting to be claimed. The human fleet lay in silence, warships drifting in the abyss like specters, their engines dormant, their weapons primed. Every vessel had been concealed for weeks, positioned with surgical precision along the gravitational shadows of Proxima's asteroid belt. Their hulls, dark and invisible to conventional scans, merged with the void. The Council had sent their forces expecting a display of defiance. Instead, they would be met with execution. On the bridge of the UHS Resolute, Admiral Catherine Sato stood with her arms crossed, eyes locked on the holographic tactical map before her. It showed the incoming fleet, larger than expected, moving with eerie precision. The Council was not blindly charging into battle. They knew something. How long until they breach our perimeter? Sato's voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Commander Elias Runn, her second-in-command, scanned the data readout. His fingers moved across the console, adjusting the projections. Less than an hour. They're faster than anticipated, and their numbers. He hesitated, then exhaled. Double what we projected. A slow, cold realization settled over them. The Council had not been caught off guard. Sato tightened her grip on the console. She had anticipated resistance, but this was something else. The Council hadn't been reacting to humanity's rebellion. They had been preparing for it. A traitor, a leak, or perhaps, worst of all, the Council had simply foreseen this outcome long before humanity had even made its choice. It doesn't matter, she said finally, forcing the thought aside. We knew this day was coming. She turned to the bridge crew. Fleet-wide alert. All captains to combat stations. A flurry of movement followed. Throughout the fleet, silent warships came alive. Shields activated, weapons powered up, and engines rumbled to life in the depths of space. The United Human Empire had spent years preparing for this moment, building its military in exile, waiting for the inevitable war. Now it had arrived. Rin studied the enemy's approach. They'll deploy their vanguard first, fast-moving corvettes meant to probe for weaknesses before the main fleet commits. Sato nodded. Standard Council doctrine, a calculated test of an opponent's defenses. But this wasn't a typical engagement. The Council expected a desperate defense, a retreat, a drawn-out war of attrition. They think we'll fall back, Sato murmured. They think we'll break under the first wave. Rin met her gaze, his expression unreadable. We won't. She turned back to the display. The fleet was arranged in what appeared to be a standard defensive blockade, a formation designed to absorb the enemy's advance, a formation designed to lie. She tapped into the command channel. All captains, hold position until the signal is given. Let them believe they have control. Acknowledgements came in rapid succession. The human fleet held its ground. The first wave of Council ships entered range. Sleek, silver warships surged forward, their plasma lances already charging. They moved like hunters sensing easy prey, accelerating toward what they thought was an unprepared enemy. Sato let them come. Let them believe. The lead ships locked onto targets. A final second of silence. Then, she gave the order. Execute. The void ignited. Human warships burst from their concealed positions, thrusters flaring to life. Railguns roared, unleashing a storm of hypervelocity rounds. Missiles streaked through the darkness, guided by AI too fast for manual countermeasures. The Council's vanguard had no time to react. The first enemy corvette shattered under the onslaught, its shields collapsing in an instant, its hull rupturing like glass. Another ship veered off course, engines failing as kinetic rounds punched through its core. The ambush was absolute. A Council destroyer tried to pull back, its turrets swiveling frantically, but the Resolute was already upon it. Plasma cannons burned through its defenses, searing through layers of armor in a cascade of molten metal. The enemy ship buckled, split apart, and was gone. The Council's vanguard fleet fractured. Sato watched from a bridge, her expression unreadable. It was over in moments. The Council's forward line, meant to probe for weaknesses, had been obliterated before they could send a single report. But the real battle had yet to begin. Ren's voice was tight. Main fleet advancing. They're adapting. Sato nodded. Let them, because this was no longer a battle for survival. This was humanity rewriting the rules of war. The silence after battle was always the most dangerous moment. The wreckage of shattered warships drifted through the Proxima asteroid field, their twisted remains turning slowly in the void. Some were human, most were Council, but all were proof that the Galactic Council's assumption of a swift execution had been a miscalculation. They had come expecting an extermination. Instead, they had found an enemy that had been waiting, hidden, sharpening its blade in the dark. And now, the second wave was coming. On the bridge of the UHS Resolute, Admiral Catherine Sato stood with arms crossed, watching the tactical display as the remnants of the first Council assault limped back toward the main fleet. What had once been an impenetrable wall of Council firepower was now fractured, riddled with missing formations and unexpected gaps. But they weren't retreating. They're adjusting. Commander Elias Runn murmured beside her. His tone was steady, but she could hear the undercurrent of tension. His eyes flicked over the updated readouts. They didn't expect the ambush, but they're not panicking. They're recalibrating their approach. Sato exhaled through her nose, her jaw tight. She had expected as much. The Council's arrogance had been their first mistake. Their discipline, however, would not be their second. The enemy fleet was repositioning. Larger warships now, their reinforced hulls gleaming under Proxima's cold light. The first wave had been a test, a vanguard to probe for weakness. This was the hammer meant to crush them. Then the console chimed. An open-frequency transmission, broadcasting not just to the Resolute, but to every ship in the fleet. The voice that came through was smooth, measured, and disturbingly calm. Human vessels, you have committed an act of treason against the Galactic Council. You have defied the natural order, and you will not be granted another opportunity to surrender. This is your final warning. A beat of silence. Ren exhaled sharply. Varesh. Sato's lips barely moved. Of course it's him. High Chancellor Varesh was not just a figurehead. He was a strategist, an enforcer, the Council's executioner in all but name. He had crushed planetary uprisings, broken rebellions before they had a chance to take root. His fleet was a legend, his methods flawless. And yet, here he was, offering terms. Sato leaned forward, activating the fleet-wide channel. Chancellor Varesh, you misunderstand the situation. There was a brief pause, then the reply. Enlighten me. She let the silence stretch before answering. We're not the ones who need to surrender. For the first time, she heard something unexpected through the speakers. Laughter. Low, quiet, unmistakably amused. I see, Varesh murmured. You believe yourselves different. Special. Do you think you are the first to challenge our authority? The first to defy us with stolen weapons and blind conviction? Rin folded his arms. You sound nervous, Chancellor. Another chuckle, colder this time. No, Commander Rin. I am simply disappointed. Sato kept her tone even. You're stalling. Another pause. Then, and you are predictable. The proximity alarm screamed to life. Sato barely had time to register the sudden spike in energy signatures before the ship shuddered violently. The Resolute's shields flared as something massive, something invisible, breached the battlefield. The display flickered, struggling to make sense of the readings. A moment later, the enemy fleet was no longer just advancing. It was surrounding them. They phased in, Rin snapped. His fingers flew over the console, his voice sharp. Quantum displacement drives. They must have pre-calculated their entry points, and a second impact rocked the ship. Sato steadied herself. Status. Shields holding, but Rin's breath hitched as the tactical map updated. They bypassed our perimeter. We're boxed in. Sato stared at the display, her mind already working through the implications. The Council had never been reckless. They had let the Vanguard fall, not because they had underestimated humanity, but because they had planned for it. They had known, and now they had executed a perfect encirclement. The voice returned. A predictable trap. Admiral Sato is still a trap. You thought yourselves the hunters. Instead, you were simply prey who got an unlucky strike. The channel cut. The enemy ships fired. A storm of energy erupted across the void. Human shields flared under the assault, struggling to absorb the incoming fire. Plasma bolts lanced through the black, striking smaller frigates that had no chance of escaping the barrage. Explosions flared across the human fleet, silent in the vacuum, but devastating nonetheless. The tide had shifted. Sato gritted her teeth. All ships evasive maneuvers. Break their formation, now. The fleet reacted instantly. Engines flared, vessels twisting and weaving through the chaos. But the Council's noose was already tightening. They were being funneled, herded like prey, toward the heart of the enemy formation. Rin swore under his breath. We don't have enough firepower to break through this line. Sato's mind raced. She had spent years preparing for war, but war had never been predictable. It was an organism that adapted, evolved, forced change upon those who dared to fight it. And humanity had always adapted faster than anyone else. She tapped into the encrypted command channel. This is Sato to Vanguard. It's time. A moment of silence. Then, a new voice crackled through the line. Deep, steady, acknowledged. Across the battlefield, another fleet, one the Council had not accounted for, decloaked. A second armada, hidden beyond Proxima's gravity well, emerged from the darkness like a blade slipping free of its sheath. Warships built in exile, forged in secrecy, now moving as one. The Vanguard led the charge, its silhouette a dark omen against the stars. And for the first time, the Council hesitated. Sato exhaled, allowing herself the smallest hint of satisfaction. Now, she said, let's turn a trap on them. The Council's counterattack came swiftly, a force driven by wrath and desperation. Their response was not mere retaliation, but an attempt to crush the rebellion before it could ignite. Planets burned in a storm of unrelenting bombardment. Entire colonies reduced to ashes under the weight of orbital bombardment. The Eridani system became a graveyard, its once thriving worlds now little more than rubble and ruin. The battles raged on for weeks, stretching into a grueling third week, but the outcome was never clear. Human forces, though smaller and outmatched, fought with a tenacity that the Council had not prepared for. Their fleets, undermanned and underpowered, fought not with the vast superiority the Council assumed, but with cunning. The humans had learned quickly and ruthlessly. Guerrilla tactics, once thought beneath the grand strategy of interstellar warfare, became their weapon of choice. The Council's fleets, though seemingly endless in number, faltered. The humans hit them where they least expected: supply chains, shipyards, fuel depots. The Council's expansive grip on the galaxy was proving its greatest weakness. The very resources that fueled their might were vulnerable to a more agile enemy. Each skirmish, every small victory, had a ripple effect, eating away at the foundation of the Council's power. In the depths of these tense days, Kane made his move. Standing in the dimly lit war room aboard the UHS Resolute, he addressed his inner circle, a group of warriors, tacticians, and visionaries who had rallied to humanity's cause. We've lost worlds, he said, his voice steady but laced with resolve. And we will lose more, but we will make them pay. Every strike they make against us will cost them. Not just soldiers, but their pride, their power. His words hit home. They weren't merely fighting for survival anymore. This was no longer a war of defense. It was a war for retribution, for sovereignty. Humanity's very existence was at stake, and every skirmish in the stars was a fight to carve their place in the galaxy. And then, humanity's final weapon was revealed, Project Aegis. The Council had dismissed it as a myth, a theoretical construct designed for future generations of war. But Kane had understood its potential long before the Council's arrogance had allowed them to underestimate the human spirit. Aegis was a warship unlike any other, designed to nullify energy-based weapons. It was capable of rendering the Council's advanced weaponry useless. A vessel that could tip the scales, destroying the technological advantage the Council had held for centuries. It was their secret weapon, and with it, the balance began to shift. In the heart of the conflict, as the Council's endless fleets were shattered and replaced by a tide of human ingenuity, the enemy began to crack. Their confidence, once so assured, began to fracture. They weren't just facing an insurgent force. They were facing something worse, a force that could adapt, that could think outside the box, and, above all, that could win. The Council found itself scrambling, attempting to regain control of their rapidly deteriorating empire. They tried to re-establish their superiority with sheer numbers, but it was too late. Humanity was no longer the underdog. They were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting to dominate. In the twilight of this shifting power struggle, Kane addressed his people once more, a speech that would be etched in the annals of history. "They think we're weak," he said, his voice amplified across every human-controlled world. "They think we're just a nuisance. But what they don't understand is that we have nothing left to lose. When they look at us, they see a fractured species, a fleeting flicker in the cold expanse of the galaxy. What they fail to see is our fire. And now, that fire will burn them." And burn they did. The Council, once supreme, now faced a truth they could not ignore. Humanity was not just fighting for its life. They were fighting to change the very fabric of the galaxy. The tide had turned. Zelkura, the Council's fortress world, had never fallen. Its defenses were impenetrable until now. The Council's leadership, sheltered in the heart of their sanctuary, believed themselves invincible. For centuries, their grip on the galaxy had been unchallenged. The Great Citadel, a monument to their power, had seen countless generations of rulers rise and fall, yet its walls stood firm, untouched by the tides of time. Now, under the assault of the human rebellion, it was beginning to crumble. The UHS Resolute cut through the void like a spear, its engines screaming with the fury of a final assault. Human and allied ships surrounded the planet, a swarm of vessels that had once seemed an afterthought to the Council. The Council's arrogance had blinded them to the humanity's growing strength, to the simple truth that a cornered species fights with an edge more dangerous than any weapon. Kane stood at the bridge, his gaze fixed on the planet below. His hands were folded behind his back, his posture stiff, yet his eyes burned with the intensity of a man who had seen too much to be swayed by emotion. His world had been torn apart, piece by piece, and the echoes of that destruction had fueled him through every battle, every struggle. Approaching the atmosphere, Commander Sato reported, her voice a cool, measured contrast to the chaos outside. "Prepare to breach," Kane replied, his voice steady, every word deliberate. The Resolute plunged downward, through the shielded defenses of Zelkura. The sky above the capital world ignited as antimatter blasts and kinetic shells collided with the planetary shield. It flickered, holding for a brief moment before shattering like glass. The Council's last line of defense was broken. From the surface, the ground trembled as human forces descended. Thousands of troop carriers, each bristling with weaponry, surged through the atmosphere like meteors. The sound of their impact was deafening. The planet's surface was scarred as craters expanded where the ships touched down, delivering soldiers and heavy artillery. Kane's heart pounded as the battle began to unfold. The world below seemed so small. It was the last bastion of a crumbling empire. But the council had made a critical error. They had underestimated the human will to fight. They had thought the rebellion a fleeting spark. Now, the flame was a firestorm. As Cain led his forces through the streets of the capital, the once proud banners of the council were torn down and replaced by the flags of the united human empire. Soldiers fought in the shadow of towering spires, where statues of past chancellors crumbled beneath the weight of human hands. The city, a relic of dominance, became a battleground where every corner was contested. Nothing was sacred. Everything was up for grabs. But within the council's grand citadel, High Chancellor Varesh remained. His thoughts were unreadable. He was seated in his private chamber, his violet eyes lost in a distant thought. The halls of the citadel were eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the planetary defense systems now turned against them. The doors to the inner chamber opened with a hiss, and Cain entered, his footsteps firm, deliberate. There was no fanfare, no speech, just a moment of reckoning. Varesh did not rise. He did not shout. His expression was tired, so much so that it almost seemed to transcend the years of political calculation and strategy that had defined him. Cain felt a momentary pause, an odd feeling that whispered of something beyond the immediate battle. Was it regret? Was it surrender? Do you think this will change anything? Varesh asked, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. He looked not at Cain, but at the walls around them, as though seeing the weight of centuries collapse with each passing second. Cain took a breath. I think it's too late for that now. For a long while, neither man spoke. The finality of the moment pressed down upon them, suffocating. Then, at last, Cain spoke again, his voice steady as ever. You had a chance. You could have adapted. You could have seen what we saw, that a new era was coming. But you held on to the old ways, believing they would keep you safe. Varesh's eyes flickered with something akin to sadness. Safety, he muttered, a foolish illusion. Then Cain raised his weapon, the cold metal gleaming in the dim light of the chamber. The High Chancellor looked at him, and for the first time, there was no challenge in his gaze. Just acceptance. Perhaps it was, Cain said as he fired. The sound echoed throughout the hall, final and deafening. Varesh's body slumped, his reign ending with the faintest exhale, as if the weight of the galaxy had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The door to the chamber swung open once more, and human soldiers flooded in, their weapons drawn, their faces set with the grim determination of those who had come too far to turn back. They had won. The war was over. Outside, the battle raged on, but inside the citadel, it was silent. Zelkura, the last bastion of the council, had fallen. The reign of the Galactic Council was over. The galaxy, once governed by a handful of powerful beings, now stood on the precipice of something new. It was not a new era, for that had already begun. It was the beginning of a new order. Cain stood, his gaze fixed on the world he had just conquered, as the sun set over the ruins of a dying empire. The galaxy was wide, and it was his now. The war had ended, but the peace that followed was neither quiet nor calm. The galaxy, still bruised from its long struggle, did not transition into order smoothly. It was as if a great storm had passed, leaving the stars themselves unsettled, their brilliant points now cold and distant, as though reflecting the shifting hearts of those left behind. Cain stood in the ruins of the council's former citadel, now a symbol of the past, surrounded by the ruins of what had once been untouchable. His eyes swept over the scorched remains of the great hall, the walls cracked, and the statues of forgotten leaders now reduced to rubble. The grand symbols of an empire built on arrogance and control now lay scattered beneath his boots. We've won, Commander Sato said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of the battle they had just concluded. But there was no joy in her tone, no celebration. Cain's response was a single word, simple and heavy. Yes. The victory felt hollow, like a bell rung in an empty hall. The world had changed, and yet the cost seemed too great, too painful for anything to feel like triumph. They were no longer just survivors. Humanity had become something new, something more dangerous, a force in the galaxy, unchained from the shackles of history and politics. But as they stood on the precipice of this new age, Cain knew that the true work had only just begun. A new order had to be built, not from the ashes of the old, but from the very dust of what had crumbled. And it would not be easy. The first days following the council's collapse were chaotic. The leaders of the smaller species, those who had once been silenced under the weight of the council's rule, scrambled for power, each hoping to claim a piece of the fractured galaxy for themselves. Cain and his allies, both human and otherwise, moved quickly to consolidate their gains, but it was not without difficulty. Old grudges ran deep, and some factions, emboldened by the council's fall, had little interest in peace. But the alliance Cain had forged, the Skelvath, the Valdari, the Jun, remained a force to reckon with. These were not the scattered rebels or naive idealists that the council had written off. These were people who understood the cost of survival, the price of rebellion. They were as determined to shape the future as Cain himself. As the dust settled on the battlefield, the diplomats began their work. Some worlds, terrified by the sudden absence of the council's heavy hand, hesitated. Would they join the new empire or risk becoming a target of the same violence they had once endured? Cain was not a man who sought compromise, but he knew that diplomacy was as crucial now as military might have been in the war. Humanity's newfound strength was undeniable, but it was also untested. Would their ambition to lead extend beyond mere survival? Would they rise above the impulse to dominate and instead create something better, something lasting? Cain sat across from a delegate of the Valdari, a race of traders and merchants who had long been forced to navigate the whims of the council's ever-changing tariffs and edicts. The Valdari's leader, a sharp-eyed woman named Delara, leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "You speak of peace, but I see no guarantees. You ask us to join your empire, but what of our sovereignty? What assurances do we have that we will not fall victim to the same overreach that defined the council's reign?" Cain met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You have my word," he said simply, but there was a weight behind it, an unspoken promise of more than just diplomacy. Delara studied him, as if trying to discern some hidden truth in his face, but at length she nodded. "You've made your point," she said. "We will join you for now. But know this, the galaxy will not be kind to a power that rules with an iron fist." Cain's smile was tight, but there was an edge of certainty to it. "We will not rule with fear. Not like the council. We will build something different." And build they did, though the task was far from simple. The remnants of the old council's influence lingered like ghosts, haunting every decision, every negotiation. Those who had benefited from the council's tyranny were not eager to relinquish their power. But slowly, methodically, Cain and his allies began to shape the contours of a new empire, one that was based not on domination, but on unity forged through the struggle of those who had fought together. In the weeks that followed, new alliances were formed, new policies implemented. The human empire began to take shape not through conquest alone, but through the careful weaving of relationships, through an understanding of what it meant to govern with respect rather than fear. Cain's vision was bold, but it was tempered by the knowledge of the consequences of unchecked ambition. He knew that ruling the galaxy required not only strength, but wisdom. Yet, even as the empire began to grow, there were whispers. In the darker corners of the galaxy, old enemies waited, waiting for the moment when the empire would falter, when the new order would crumble under its own weight. Some believed the empire was built on shaky foundations, a house of cards that would collapse as soon as the winds of ambition turned too strong. But Cain was not a man who feared what might come. He had fought too hard, bled too much to back down now. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity would never again be a footnote in the annals of galactic history. They had earned their place at the table, and they would fight to keep it. The galaxy, still raw from the wounds of war, had entered a new era. It was an era forged in fire, in blood, in betrayal. But it was also an era filled with promise. What would come of it? No one knew. But for the first time, the galaxy was truly theirs to shape, and they would.